Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Bible podcast. And today I'm joined by Rabbi Tovia Singer. I'll have the links to purchase his books. Let's get biblical in the description below in the pinned comment. And also his YouTube channel. His YouTube channel will be tagged in the description below as well. So if you're not subscribed to his YouTube channel, you can subscribe to it right now. That being said, Tovia, it's good to have you back on the show.
Always great to be here, Jacob.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. So today I want to talk about, I titled the show The Gospel Fraud, the New Testament Lies Exposed. So the Gospels, they misquote the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And we covered this before with Paul's letters as well. Paul does this too. He talks about phantom scriptures, phantom quotations that are just not, that the passages in the Old Testament that don't exist, but he's claiming that they do and stuff like that. Or also a letter to the Hebrews, which does not say it was written by Paul. That's anonymous. At least it presents itself that way. But what I want to focus on right now is the Gospels. So when the Gospels quotes the Hebrew Bible, does the Septuagint, the first thing I want to cover is, does the Septuagint factor into that or not?
Well, the Septuagint follows the Christian Bible and seeks to provide cover. Now, that's going to be very confusing for the viewers because you've been taught that the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was written roughly 256 BCE, which means 250 years before Jesus was even born. So how is that possible? So we just have to get this point out of the way. The original Septuagint, it's called the Septuagint LXX because it was a translation by 70 or 72 learned men of only the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. It's lost. The Alexandrian library is gone, destroyed. And subsequently, there are many Greek translations that were produced by the church. Origen would be the most important, significant contributor to what you now know as the Septuagint. So what the church would do is adjust the Greek translation in order to comport with mistranslations or corruptions in the Gospels. So now in school, you're always taught that the New Testament writers are following the Septuagint. Don't think that anymore. People just accept that as absolute orthodox. That's not correct at all. It's rather the Septuagint. So just as one other point, so we're not going to be confused about this, every Greek translation subsequent to the original Septuagint, which is really the Proto-Septuagint, calls itself the Septuagint. So therefore, it's very confusing. So the Greek translation done by Origen, the 3rd century church father, it's called the Septuagint, even though it's not the original. Like if every subsequent English translation after the King James called itself the King James Version, that would be very confusing. Thankfully, they're called NIV, a New American Standard. So that's what's really going on. The Septuagint is that's in our hands, is largely a Christian product.
So in other words, you're saying that originally the Septuagint was just a translation of the Torah, but
of the 5 books of Moses, right? Not the prophets, not the writings.
And so all that extra stuff, all these additional translations that appears to have deliberately mistranslated certain passages in the Hebrew Bible to fit the New Testament or post-New Testament's what you're saying.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And to convey this, because I think the viewers are like stunned to hear this. This goes against everything you've been taught. I mean, if you're a Protestant, like why is the apocryphal writings, which means what Catholics call the deuterocanonical works, why are they in the Septuagint? It's so preposterous. Like take a book like The Wisdom of Solomon as an example. So that book was originally written in Greek. Why would it be translated in Greek? So it's all. So you have to get out of your mind that when you go on Amazon and order a Septuagint, which you can do, you can find it. You can find it online. It's readily available. Get it out of your mind that the New Testament authors are following the Septuagint. That's not the case. Septuagint is going to be written in order to bolster the corruptions found in the Christian Bible.
So when was this expanded Septuagint created that you're talking about?
No, it's a cottage industry. Interestingly, in the preface to the 1611 King James Bible, which was produced by 47 men in good standing in the Church of England, scholars, Cambridge, Oxford fellows, they write there. I mean, the reason they're following the Masoretic text is there were so many Greek translations that you really just, you can't even, like, which one do you follow? So what happens is a very significant number of Jews are in North Africa. They're not literate in Hebrew. The Christian community is growing rapidly. They want access to the Greek. Greek was like English today. It was the language, right? So as a result, it becomes a cottage industry. People are just producing Greek translations. Origen, who is no doubt the most prolific of the Christian thinkers, certainly in the patristic period, who's producing a hexapla, who's producing a Greek translation side by side with others and a Hebrew, he's going to be the final contributor to what we know now as a Septuagint. It's not monolithic that way. There are texts in the Septuagint that don't support Christian readings. That's because earlier renderings, relics are in the Septuagint. I mean, I would surprise you with stuff that's there and not there. So it's what we have in our Septuagint today. Again, if you go online, is all the texts in the New Testament are covered, are protected, so that when Isaiah 7:14 is mistranslated by Matthew, and Matthew reads in 123 in the infancy narrative of the first gospel that, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. So that word, there's no virgin in the Hebrew, but the putative Greek translation, Parthenos, is present. Now, the word Parthenos doesn't necessarily mean a virgin, but the key point is the Septuagint is there to provide cover for Matthew.
Does it also cover quotations of the Hebrew Bible in other gospels like Mark and Luke, for instance? Does it do this when it comes to them from what you've seen?
Yeah, and also Paul's epistles as well. It provides cover for Luke chapter 4 when giving sight to the blind, a misquote of Isaiah 61, so you'll find it in the Septuagint. Strangely, sometimes they blow it. As it turns out, Isaiah 9, verse 5 and 6, which does say, the wonderful advisor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, called his name Prince of Peace. That actually doesn't even appear in the Septuagint. And it's very striking that because Christians came to adore that passage, Isaiah 9, 5, 6, 6, and 7 in the Christian Bible, they prefer the Masoretic reading of that than the Septuagint. So it's always providing cover for all of the Christian Bible. You mentioned the book of Hebrews, which church fathers believed was written by Paul. The church fathers believe that Paul authored 14 letters in the Christian Bible. Today, it's that notion that the epistles of Hebrews written by Paul has largely been abandoned. Regardless, the book of Hebrews has corruptions, as an example. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5 is an example. The context is that the author of this, it's called an epistle to the Hebrews. It's not really a letter at all. It's really a screed or a sermon. It's an attack on Judaism. And the book of Hebrews wants you to believe that the whole sacrificial system of animals that existed was really a shadow and all pointing to Christ. It never really could atone for sin. That's the context, and it's all pointing to Christ. That is Pauline. And then Hebrews 10 verse 5 supposedly is quoting Psalm 40 verse 6 and 7. And it says, sacrifices and offerings you do not desire. Now, if you look in Hebrews, it says, but a body you have prepared for me, burnt offerings and sin offerings you have not required. So a body you have prepared for me. Okay. But if you go back to Psalm 40, verse 6, there's no body you prepared for me. That's a complete promiscuous rendering, a corruption of the original text. Well, the Septuagint on Psalm 40, verse 6, does have a body prepared for me, so that the Septuagint provides cover for the mistranslation that whoever wrote Hebrews wrote it in about the year 64. Is certainly Pauline. It certainly was not Paul, but provides cover for that. Just a point that could be lost on the viewers, and that is very few people in the ancient world could read Hebrew. Only two church fathers were completely fluent in Hebrew. Only Origen and Jerome. That was it. None of the other church fathers were conversant in Hebrew and Greek. Only two. So Hebrew was something just not accessible to people. Greek was. Greek was the language of the church, and then it would become Latin in the Western church. So absolutely, the Septuagint it's like the bleach that criminals use to wipe away fingerprints. It's there to go, oh no, the New Testament isn't misquoting anything. And then, if you hear Christian apologists, they'll go, well, the oldest Masoretic text we have is the Aleppo Codex or something along those lines. That's a false shuffle. We have Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the Talmud, which was written, compiled, and completely edited by the very beginning of the 6th century, where almost all of Tanakh is quoted. So we know what it says.
So now I want to go back to the Gospel of Mark and focus more on what it's claiming that Jesus is fulfilling prophecies from the Hebrew Bible without involving the Septuagint for a moment. It talks about, so it cites Isaiah, and it talks about a voice in the wilderness, and it tries to make it seem like that's going to lead up to Jesus, and that's what the Hebrew Bible was talking about. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a combination of texts, but it's misciting. It's two passages really conflating. It's a passage in Isaiah, and it's another passage from the book of Malachi, and sort of compressed together. In fact, in some renderings of Mark chapter 1, verse 2, like, for instance, the King James Version, it doesn't use the word Isaiah, but just says the prophets. So they were smart enough to take that out, because essentially it's a quote from the book of Malachi. So so that one would not consider the opening, let's call it the incipit of the book of Mark, which is the oldest surviving gospel, to be a massive corruption. They got the wrong book, or are conflating two passages when opening up the story which follows, and that's John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, which is the opening scene of the book of Mark. I mean, there's no infancy narrative in the book of Mark as you find in Matthew and Luke. There's no prologue of this high Christology that you find in John. Mark goes incipit, and then our story of John the Baptist, who no doubt was a prominent figure in the 1st century. He's a real historical figure. He's a real celebrity of the 1st century. If he's baptizing Jesus, that's very meaningful, and that's going to be amped up quite a bit in Luke, where John the Baptist is not only baptizing Jesus, but he's family, he's cousins. So now he's heightening that as well. That sort of corruption is, I think, very minor. It's just a mistake. There's no I don't think it was deliberately done. That means the words are not changed or not altered as you find in other places. Matthew is the one who really engages. Matthew and Paul are the two contributing authors to the Christian canon that are going to very frequently alter the Hebrew Bible in order to make it appear Christological. Paul is going to get away with it because Paul's audience, intended audiences, are non-Jews. His letters are into audiences that are not Jewish. They're Gentiles, and therefore they wouldn't have a clue. Matthew we don't know who wrote Matthew. We don't know where it was written. If someone tells us they know it, they don't. But Matthew definitely had a Jewish audience in mind, and therefore he has these famed 11 fulfillment citations. He is clearly trying to convince Jews to convert to Christianity. What is very striking about Matthew, it's one of the ironies of the history of the church, is that it could be said that there was no person in history that was more responsible for the Jewish rejection of the Christian religion than the author of the first gospel. If Matthew had not existed, if Irenaeus, late second century, had decided not to include Matthew in the canon, so all you had with three gospels as an example, yet Mark and Luke and John, many more Jews might have converted to Christianity, might have joined it. Matthew makes it impossible because he's very deliberately and very transparently mistranslating the Hebrew Bible, and making up verses like Paul does. Just makes up verses that don't even exist.
So one of the things that they like to do is they like to link Hebrews 1:8 to Psalms 45:17 regarding perpetual memory. His name will be remembered forever, as a prophecy foretelling that Jesus will be remembered forever.
Right. The problem with this text is that, as it turns out, the scepter represents kingship, royalty. As it turns out, the majority of the world doesn't believe in Jesus, does not accept him as king, so it doesn't work out. I think Hebrews has in mind here, the context is that Jesus is above the angels, and I think he also has in view here Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, but it doesn't line up at all.
Well, number one that they quote from Psalms is Psalms 55:15 about the destruction of enemies, and they like to say that somehow is a prediction about Judas's death in Matthew and Acts.
Right, but once again, Jesus didn't destroy his enemies, right? If anything, he was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the key point. I mean, the critical point is that Psalm 55 or Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is one of the most quoted passages in all the New Testament, right? Well, the key of Psalm 110 is that this blessing is that you're going to be you are going to crush your enemies. Now, it's misapplied, mistranslated. We could talk about that. But he didn't do any of those things. You see, what's striking is that everything that Jesus putatively fulfilled is not a prophecy at all. So that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there's no prophecy of the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That Jesus would be born of a virgin. So those he supposedly fulfilled, but there's no prophecy like that. That the Messiah would defeat his enemies, or that David would defeat his enemies. Well, he didn't do that. And then what you must do is say, well, he's going to fill that in the second coming. Well, if the Messiah can come twice, then my sister-in-law could be the Messiah. She didn't do anything. Well, it's a second coming. It's very clear also, it's transparent in the Gospels that those who authored it anticipated that Jesus was going to fill all these things during that generation, during the lifetime of the first followers of Jesus. You can see that in Mark chapter 9 and Mark chapter 13 as an example. The generation will not pass until many of you standing here will not taste of death until all these things occur. They don't occur. So as it turns out, everything the Messiah is supposed to do, it is true that the Messiah will destroy the enemies of Israel and ultimately bring war to an end. Clearly, that there would be a universal knowledge of God, clearly in the Hebrew Bible. If that had occurred, we'd sure know about that today. I live 62 miles northeast of the Gaza Strip. There's a war going on right now, right there, about 100 kilometers from me. There's a war in Ukraine. There's a war in Nigeria. We would know about that. So therefore, all the things that Jesus supposedly fulfilled, if he didn't, if by chance he wasn't born to a virgin, by chance, would you know about today? Hardly. If Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem, but what is more likely born in Nazareth, how would you know it today? You would have no access to that kind of information. So all the stuff he's done, there's no way that they're unfalsifiable. All the things he will supposedly do, whether it's destroy his enemies, you're quoting Isaiah, Psalm 55, Psalm 110, those are the very things that he did not accomplish.
Richard Epler, thank you for your super chat. Appreciate it. So another one I'd like to ask you about is and we've covered this before, but I want to cover it again. Psalm 22:16. They like to quote this as if it predicts Jesus being nailed on the cross. Like a lion, they pierced my hands and my feet. That's how they like to translate it.
Right. So, so it's been mistranslated by the church. So if you read Psalm 22, now, just as a heads up, Psalm 22:16 in a Christian Bible is Psalm 22:17 in a Jewish Bible. It's the same verse. Why is not germane right now, but just the same thing. So, so what it says, the original text is that dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers have surrounded me, encircled me, like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet. Who does that sound like it's speaking about? You're not sure. Doesn't sound, you're not quite sure who that could be speaking about. If, however, you opened up that passage in a Christian Bible, the ending, the last part of Psalms 22, verse 16 would read, they pierced my hands and my feet. Well, that surely does sound like a crucifixion, piercing hands and feet. Now, the Hebrew, the last words in the Hebrew text is ko'ari yodai raglai, which means like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet. So the word ko'ari means like a lion. Ko'ari, Kof, Aleph, Resh, Yud. Ari means lion, like George W. Bush's press secretary was Ari Fleischer. His name means a lion. Ko'ari, the prefix, means like a lion. King David in this psalm is describing his enemies. He is, prior to this passage, as a few passages earlier, compared his enemies to wild animals, as in this passage as well, as dogs, previously bulls of Bashan and lions, and he'll do it again. So lions in this chapter represent King David's many enemies. For those who don't know this, King David had lived a very difficult life. His best friend betrayed him. His father-in-law wanted to kill him. He was on the run. He had, I mean, I don't know if you've been betrayed. King David had, and everyone around him is trying to kill him. And ultimately, this leads to Psalm 23, where the Lord is my shepherd, very famous chapter. But the key point is this: the text reads, Ka'ari yodai v'raglai, like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet. Now, they are at the, that's a, so these verbs of being almost never appear in biblical Hebrew. So, like a lion, at my hands and my feet. So you just change the words like a lion, you remove them. Let's say you have, you select it with your mouse, and now you have white letters on a blue background. You tap the delete key, and then you instead type in the words they pierced, and now you have a brand new message. The text has been completely altered in order to make it appear Christological. Psalm 22, incidentally, is a chapter that is quoted in the Christian Bible. For example, the cry of dereliction in the book of Mark. Jesus saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's taken from Psalm 22, from the very beginning of Psalm 22. Now, Psalm 22 is not a prophecy of the future. It's King David speaking about his own predicament in the first person. There's nowhere in this chapter where he says, in the future, the Messiah will say these things or do these things. It doesn't say that anywhere. So Psalm 22 is King David crying out to God, saying, in the past, you listened to my ancestors when they were in trouble, but all I hear is silence. We can relate to that. So he's describing his many problems. He is not describing, there's not a prophecy of the future. So the text was altered, and of course the Septuagint supports this reading. One caveat, now this is going to surprise you, and that is, you would expect with such a corruption that a reading of they pierced my hands and my feet, if the authors of the New Testament, the contributing authors of the Christian Bible, knew that was such a verse, they would surely have quoted it. Like they cast lots for my clothing. That's in Psalm 22. They were very familiar with this chapter. You can be sure if they thought it said they pierced my hands and my feet, you can be certain that one of the 27 books of the Christian Bible would have quoted it, or even books that didn't make it into the canon, like the Gospel of Peter. It isn't in any of them, because this is a later corruption. No one thought of it. No one in the first century, it just didn't occur to them to alter that text. You could do the forensics on this. Psalm 22:16, as pierced my hands and my feet, emerges in the second century, where someone corrupts the text in order to make it appear Christological. So here you can change one word in a passage, and suddenly you have a new message. How do you play with my Bible? And if you're going to alter the Hebrew scriptures, you think I'm going to convert to Christianity? That's quite silly.
What would you say is like one of the top few of the most ridiculous alleged prophetic links to Jesus that you've ever heard, if you had to name a few?
Okay, so there's an elephant in the room, and I think you'll agree with me, Jacob. The most significant thing is the whole story. We can look at these individual texts, which we'll do together, but the notion that the Messiah is going to come and die and then resurrect, that's something that's a complete afterthought of the church, when Jesus didn't do any of these things, but rather did what thousands of other Jews did, and that is die on a cross. That's the big thing. People can get caught up, on corruptions in the Christian Bible of the Jewish Bible, but what about just the story? The Messiah, first of all, the innocent cannot die for the sins of the wicked. Look, I know people are watching me in the United States, as an example. Some of you voted red, some of you voted blue, some of you voted for Miss Harris, some of you voted for Mr. Trump. It doesn't matter where your politics lie. I am sure that you want to be confident that whatever country you're in, that there aren't innocent people who are punished in the criminal justice system while guilty people go free. I mean, right? Well, the idea that there could be a human sacrifice, the Messiah is supposed to die, that itself is a complete invention of the church. So we can look at verses, and this is something Paul seeks to explain. And he does it in a way that Christians don't even notice this. Paul admits that this whole thing is a new revelation and wasn't originally there. So this is very critical. We just need to wrap our brain around this for a moment. Paul insists that he has access to this revelation that the Messiah is going to come twice, and he had to die for our sins and then come a second time, to rise from the dead and come a second time. It was a grand mystery, and no one knew about it. And only he had access to this information. He says this explicitly in Ephesians chapter 3. He says, I have this revelation, which is a complete, this is the mystery religion, that this is esoteric knowledge that only I have, and no one else got this revelation. In fact, in an indisputed letter of Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8, Paul said that if the leaders of the generation, I mean, those who crucified Jesus, if they would have had access to this mystery, that the Messiah is supposed to come twice, they're supposed to die and rise, they would have, in his words, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. Isn't that just mind-blowing? So this is an intriguing topic when people are manipulating text and are playing a game of hide the ball. Absolutely. These corruptions are the kinds of things that we'll talk about, are the kind of things that get attorneys disbarred because they play with documents. But the first thing is books or letters or literature, canonical literature in the New Testament that is much older than the Gospels. The letters of Paul, the oldest surviving canonical text. Paul's letters are more than 2 decades older than the Gospels. Well, Paul is saying this whole thing is a grand mystery. Well, what are you talking about? So we started there. The whole notion of a second coming is an invention of Paul. Now we can go to the New Testament. Now you're asking which is the most scandalous. you're asking what's worse, crack or heroin. I don't know. Anytime you alter an original text in a putative translation, you've created an enormous scandal. So Matthew is doing this right from the get-go. And Matthew's is just off the charts. For example, Matthew begins telling us that Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the opening passage, Matthew 1:1. And he then goes on to provide us a supposed genealogy of Joseph. But according to Matthew, Jesus wasn't even a descendant of Joseph. Rather, Jesus was conceived miraculously to Mary. So Joseph's putative genealogy has no effect on Jesus. And Joseph didn't adopt Jesus. I mean, who gave him up for adoption? And then not only that, in Matthew 1, verse 17, I mean, this is wild stuff. So after we're given this genealogy, it's really 41 names, but we're then told that there's a reason why there are 3 sets of 14 generations. Okay, ignoring that one is missing for another reason, and it's because it's 14 times 3. But in order for Matthew to have accomplished that, he actually had to remove 4 names, but 5 are removed. That's insane. Now, why does he like the number 14? I mean, this shell game is shocking, because in gematria, which is the numerical value of each letter in the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 consonants, there's an assigned value to them. So Daled, the 4th letter, in the alphabet, in the Hebrew alphabet, is equivalent to 4, Vav is 6, another Dal is another 4, 464. Let's praise the Lord. That's 14. So 14 is not only 7 times 2, which is like 7 is like a big number times 2. That's like a multiplier. But you have the gematria of David's name. Well, that's really quite striking. Going on from there, I mean, let alone that last set of 14 names that were given, covers a span, we are told, from Jeconia, who ruled, let's say, 600 BC, about there. So, gee, that's like 600 years. How would you have 14 generations? Like, just do the number. That means each generation is like 42 years. That's not possible. So it's clearly completely convoluted. I mean, just divide 600, right? And I'm being a little generous here. Just divide 600 by 14, whatever it comes out to, 42. I don't have the number in my head. You can't have a generation that's 42 years. So the whole thing is completely made up. And Matthew, by claiming that Jesus was conceived to a virgin, sabotages the whole claim that Jesus could be the Messiah, because the Messiah has to be a descendant of the tribe of Judah and the house of David, and only the patrilineal genealogy matters. Women don't matter here in this regard. Mothers do convey Jewishness, but fathers alone can convey tribe identity. See Numbers chapter 1, verse 18. So it's just dizziness. That's all it's just like a spin cycle. And then, I mean, it's really, quite famous, when we're told that Joseph, although betrothed to Mary, had yet not been with her, and he's told by the angel that which has been that Mary's with a child, and he discovers that she's with a child. He wants a divorce. He doesn't want to make a public example out of her, but ultimately he's told that, look, that this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Don't put not away Mary, because that which is within the womb is of the Holy Spirit, and she will conceive and bear a son. And then misquoting Isaiah 7:14 in verse 23 of Matthew chapter 1. So, that's just, these are so many layers. This is going to be very offensive if you're a Christian. But it's so offensive to Jews. This is like layers of idiocy and just layers upon layers, accretions and accretions of layers of things that are so, yeah, I mean, that's like really, really shocking. And then that he would be, and we can go on his putative birth in Bethlehem. That's complete corruption. A made-up verse at the end of Matthew 2:23, no verse like. So that's the infancy narrative of Matthew is very striking for being loaded with corruptions. The infancy narrative of Matthew is completely different than Luke. I mean, it makes the 4 passion narratives appear coherent and consistent. I mean, Matthew and Luke, where you find the only infancy narratives, 2 chapters each, they have nothing to do with each other, except that Jesus' mother's name is Mary, and she was a virgin. He was born in Bethlehem. Otherwise, they have absolutely nothing in common. Those are very, very striking, I think.
One of the other things that they like to quote is Jonah being in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, and they'll say that, hey, that's actually about Jesus.
Well, it's not they say it. Matthew says it. Matthew says this in Matthew chapter 12.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And it's the sign of the whale. It's very striking because the book of Jonah is very moving. It's so much so that every synagogue in the world on Yom Kippur, we read the book of Jonah. What is being conveyed there? Here's a very wicked city, the capital is Syrian Empire. They sin and God forgives them because they repented and turned back to God. God forgives them. If God can forgive these people, he can surely forgive you. Isn't that striking that the book of Jonah is quoted frequently in the Christian Bible? We are told that the Christianity is a religion that addresses the problem of sin. It addresses this problem of sin. Isn't it odd that the book of Jonah is completely devoted to demonstrating that anyone can repent and God will forgive them if they're sincere? And that theme is nowhere found in the Christian Bible, despite the fact that the book is quoted. In this case, it's Matthew chapter 12, of the sign of Jonah. It's going to be quoted a number of times for different reasons. So just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so will Son of Man be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. I want to make this very clear. I would not use this when speaking to a Christian. So the way the argument is formed is that when we look at the Gospels, we find that Jesus, in any of the Passion narratives, we find that Jesus was in the tomb for at the most 3 days and 2 nights. According to John, it would be, according to John, it's 2 days and 2 nights, because in John 20, it's still dark when Mary shows up. But I want to, so therefore, it doesn't work, right? I want to do what I ordinarily would not do, and that is do not say that to a Christian, because most Christians would be put off by that. Most Christians would say, you're being rather pedantic, you're being picayune, don't you get the full picture? So I don't suggest raising that. Now, Christians, when this question is posed to them, they strangely use rabbinic literature to dodge this problem. In that, in rabbinic literature, in Jewish law, mixas yom kekula yom, which means that a part of a day is like the entire day in many areas of Jewish law. So, for example, my father passed away, I don't know, half a year ago. After my father was buried on a Sunday, so it was still Sunday during the day, and I then sit Shiva, which is a mourning process that lasts for 7 days, as an example. So because I buried my father during the day, so even part of that first day of sitting and mourning, again, 7 days are required, that counts as day number 1, okay? Right? Now, that's true. That's true. Now, Christians are using this rabbinic law, which is a real rabbinic law, to explain away this problem, Matthew chapter 12. The problems here are manifold. Number one, these Christians don't believe in rabbinic law. They mock rabbinic Judaism without pause and claim that the Talmud has no authority whatsoever. So they cherry pick anything in rabbinic literature. You'll hear this constantly, that can possibly rescue them, and use it as a fig leaf in order to dodge these problems. Okay. Again, I don't recommend using this when speaking to a Christian. There are really things that would speak to the heart of a Christian. This would not. The other problem with it is that this law only applies if it's let's say 7 days. So any part of that first day is like an entire day. That's true, but not if a text says 3 days and 3 nights. So there is very clearly conveying 3 days and 3 nights, and that law would not apply. But just bear this in mind. Christians love Jesus. This is very much a personality cult. They love Jesus. And if you raise this kind of issue, it sounds like to them Talmudic hair splitting. It sounds like a bad faith argument. So I would just caution you that when speaking to a Christian, that's not something you want to raise. Not because it's technically invalid, but because it not only won't be meaningful to a Christian, it'll say to him, oh, there you go. You like the Son of God is there, he's dying for you, and you're getting caught up with these small issues. So I would strongly suggest never raising that when talking to a Christian.
JM, thank you for the super chat and the thumbs up. Appreciate it. One last thing I'd like to ask you about before we close for today is Malachi 4:5. This is in reference to Matthew 3:1-3, 11:10-14, 17:11-13. Because Matthew, so the Christians that read that stuff interpret Malachi 4:5 when it talks about sending the prophet Elijah before the dreadful day of the Lord comes to be a link to Jesus.
They would if they were reading Matthew, but I mean, this is really so. It's really astonishing that they would say this, because as it turns out, so they would say that that Elijah come and he's among you, and this is John the Baptist. The problem is, I mean, this just makes the problem so mind-blowing, because at the get-go, John the Baptist is asking, like, who are you? Like, what's your deal? Are you Elijah? And he goes, no. So what are you even talking about? Moreover, I mean, if we just look at the last 5 passages of Malachi, which is the last of the prophets, it's a beautiful pericope, right? What's supposed to happen? Families are reunited. The crooked ways are made straight. Children and parents are restored to each other. And that's the picture. So it is the coming Elijah the prophet who's going to bring justice to the world. Just as a point, so the book of Malachi is answering questions. And the question at the end of chapter 2 is, where is there justice in the world? Ultimately, in the Messianic age, there will be justice, and families, a part of that is that families will be restored. Remember the Torah of Moses that was given to you at Horeb, at Mount Sinai, and Christianity's done away with it. But moreover, family, the very last verses, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers. That's the last verse. So John the Baptist says he's not Elijah the prophet. And moreover, if we go to Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says, verse 34, 35, 36, I didn't come to bring peace on earth, but the sword, to set families against each other, children against their parents and in-laws. So where did you even come up with that? So as it turns out, if a Christian were to appeal to the last verses of what Christians regard as the Hebrew Bible, the book of Malachi, that there can be no better proof that Jesus is not the Messiah. None of these things occurred. And in fact, the Gospels, which no doubt are trying to explain away why did Christianity in the first century divide families, says, well, Jesus said it was supposed to happen, but that's precisely the opposite of the prophecy that we discover in Malachi, the very passages that you quote. So this is really quite mind-blowing. And Jesus didn't bring peace, but the sword, his own words in Matthew chapter 10.
So I'd like to remind everybody that Rabbi Tovia Singer's YouTube channel will be tagged in the description below, including the links to Let's Get Biblical, volumes 1 and 2 will also be in the description below, and the pinned comment as well. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Rabbi Singer.
Always a joy.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.